I must be your speaker. I'm the only guy here with a necktie. I would like to commend all of you at the Historical Society here and Jennifer and Kirby for this great book. It reminds me of a story that Harold McCracken, who was my predecessor at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, now the Buffalo Bill Center for the West, he met Ernest Hemingway. And Mr. Hemingway said to Dr. McCracken, I've read all your books. And McCracken couldn't return the favor. So I just want to admit right up front that I've read every book on Russell there is except for Kirby and Jennifer's. But I commend you, and I'm going to get to it soon. And I'm so sorry that Joan couldn't be here. She preceded me at the Institute for Western Art at the Denver Art Museum, and she was my senior scholar for my short tenure there. I also wouldn't be here this morning if it weren't for Sarah Burt, who was curator at the Russell Museum and has passed away, and I'm filling in for her. So we have another pinch hitter here, second tier squad here coming up to try to fill in. But she would have been very pleased by today. She would have been very impressed by what Kirby and Jennifer have done. She would have been honored and proud and excited to be here today. So I take all those feelings into myself and hope I share them with you today. It's pretty important that we remember Sarah's efforts over the years at the Joslin Museum and at the Russell Museum, and we miss her. I'm also, as Joan admitted in her preface, I'm humbled to be here today in the presence of at least two people, but one particularly, Brian Dippy. Most of my remarks are plagiarized directly from Brian's work. And he and I have been working together in the field of Frederick Remington and Charles Russell most of our long careers. And so it's an honor to be at his side today in kicking off this great new volume and this great new exhibition and this renewed kind of enthusiasm that we see here in Helena for the work and life of Charlie Russell. And I'm honored also to be here with, you know the name of Amon G. Carter and Thomas Gilcrease, the two great collectors of Russell's work in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. We're here today with Tom Petrie, who is today's reigning collector of Charlie Russell works. And so I'm very grateful to be with him sitting here. So. All that said, our story starts in 1904 with a guy named Caspar Whitney. He was the esteemed editor of America's popular and seminal recreational magazine, Outing, and you see this on the screen, Outing magazine. And he had just recently met the most popular and most seminal artist from Montana, Charlie Russell. The place is New York City. Charlie and Nancy had gone there to explore what possibilities there might have been for them in the nation's capital of art and publishing. And Whitney was so impressed by his meeting with Charlie Russell that he wrote a story that appeared in the December issue of Outing magazine, and it was titled Russell, the West's Cowboy Artist. Nothing new here. But the first sentence is kind of interesting. He says, the virile life of the Great West has had no lack of interpreters. But it is only once in a while that a true genius arrives on the scene. A true genius. The man who is capable of putting down, quote, quote, the real thing. So Whitney had seen the real thing a lot of times in his life. He had been the sports editor for Harper's Magazine, and he'd worked with A.B. Frost and Frederick Remington, so he knew what the real thing was like. But he recognized in the matter of pictorial interpretation of the American West that there was something extraordinary in what he found in Russell that stood out prominently in the forefront as one Russell did, as one who could portray what he called the true picture. Now, Cowboy Artist, Mr. Russell, had been hearing that stuff a long time from newspapermen here in Montana, from politicians who liked to rub shoulders with Charlie, from fellow drovers who he painted pictures for. But this was the first time he'd really seen this in print on a national level, so even Charlie Russell was impressed with himself that day. The veracity of expression combined with the innate talent made for a remarkably potent creative combination in Whitney's mind. And it's that kind of perception of Russell that has remained with us for the last 4 generations since 1904. That kind of feeling for a potent creative force that was embodied in the persona of Charlie Russell. Now, what Whitney really liked about Russell's work were its action. It's what Joan was talking about. Its veracity, its vitality, its spontaneity, its truth of observation. He was considered to be a pictorial witness to the scenes that he portrayed. Fidelity, he brings that up many times in the article, fidelity to actual Western conditions. But above all, Whitney saw in this work a reflection of the artist himself. A manifestation of an extraordinary personal determination. He saw Russell's stature as an artist in his own land, the West, as being very important, but he also saw Russell's ability to transcend what he termed as the environment of the cow camp, to make art that could, in his estimation, and did, in his estimation, hold sway over audiences both in the East, this new audience that Russell was trying to attract, and in Montana. So his attention to his work was going to spread beyond the borders of Montana. Well, that's all well and good. But Whitney's an editor and a writer for sports magazines, primarily. And he was basically ill-equipped to talk about Russell's art beyond those thematic focuses. And it was another writer of the time, a woman named Catherine Wilson, who was a writer for a magazine that had its home in Portland, Oregon, but I believe she was in New York at the time. Brian will correct me on this. A magazine known as the Pacific Monthly. And she addressed all those things in addition to his subjects. She went on beyond that to talk about him stylistically and technically as an artist. How does this guy measure up to other artists that I'm aware of in the American art canon of the day? And so while she was impressed with his creative vision regarding things Western, she also noticed a certain carelessness in his articulation of form. She also noticed an indiscriminate washiness in his oils, an indifference to treatment of his foregrounds in his paintings, and a naivete in his handling of color. Now, Russell also met and chummed around with several New York artists at the time. Most were illustrators like John Marchand on the left, who was a wannabe cowboy from Manhattan, and Will Crawford on the right, who didn't have any aspirations to be a cowboy. He just wanted to be a good pen and ink man. And by God, he really was a good pen and ink man. And they graciously introduced Russell to magazine editors like Caspar Whitney, because Nancy felt that the publicity would be good if he could get illustrating some stories in national literature that would add to his popularity, nationally expand his audience, and bring in a little money, as was Nancy's constant want. But what they found was, in fact, a rather waning interest in Western stuff, in Western material. Raphael Christie has pointed out in some of his writings that Outing magazine that Whitney worked for was in fact about the only magazine in the East that had any interest anymore in the West. The very influences that were driving Frederick Remington away from illustration, and maybe you know enough about Remington to know that the year before he'd signed a contract with Collier's magazine to produce 12 paintings a year, once a month, but they weren't to be illustrations. They were to be fine art paintings that would be illustrated in the magazine as Western pictures. That's where Remington was going the other direction, just as Russell arrives on the scene looking for possibilities as an illustrator. But those very same influences would ultimately affect Mr. Russell. He would soon find that the accolades that were lavished upon him by Caspar Whitney were going to be of relatively little use to him if he desired to develop further as an artist. The person or type of persons that he really needed to listen to were Catherine Wilson. He, like Remington, would need to learn to paint for art's sake if he wanted to attract larger and particularly Eastern audience. He would have to supplement that real thing that Caspar Whitney was so enthused about by developing new strategic aesthetic dimensions to his work: compositional coherence, harmony of palette, intensity of color, technical advances that would give him a different kind of actual artwork, but also, if he wanted to attract an Eastern audience, he had to develop a sense of mythic remembrance. Mythic remembrance, the kind of pictures that Remington was beginning to produce if he wanted to attract Eastern audiences. So although Russell profited only marginally from introductions to literary editors like Whitney, he did gain vastly from rubbing shoulders with those few artists and writers. So transformative was this experience in 1904 for Russell in regard to his art career that we can fairly divide Russell's art life in half, a bifurcated career. 20 years from 1885 or so to 1905, and 20 years from 1905 until 1926, the end of his life and his career. Now, in my estimation, and the marketplace doesn't reflect this, but in my estimation, neither one of those two periods is more remarkable, more interesting than the other. They're just different. They're both really fascinating. And together, they reveal a really complex and motivated and eager artistic personality whose sense of innocence, whose sense of wonder, whose sense of really human empathy, whose devotion, profound devotion to Western iconography, and whose creative genius that Mr. Whitney recognized, never left him throughout either period of his life. Those things never changed on his way from being a regional phenomenon to becoming a national and international artist of acclaim. So chapter 1, shaping a career. Russell once wrote that since I can remember, I was drawing and painting since I can remember. And certainly soon after he became part of the Montana cowboy scene in the early 1880s, he began recording pictorially the life of the cowboy around him. And those recordings were naively articulated, they were dully monochromatic, but they were spontaneous, and they represented a sort of youthful sense of energy and exuberance and action. Even in early works, he showed a complexity of presentation. Breaking Camp of 1885, reputedly his first oil, though haphazard in its composition, each cowboy is doing its own thing, or his own thing, was, in a way, a composite of all the things that cowboyness meant to Charlie Russell. And it is, as an oil painting, it's fairly richly colored and rather accomplished in its sense of light and atmosphere. And thematically or conceptually or philosophically, it presages Theodore Roosevelt's call to America's youth to indulge in what he called the strenuous life. These show young men relishing in the life of adventure in the open wilds. Unlike Breaking Camp, this painting, Waiting for a Chinook of 1887, is iconic as much for its compositional cohesiveness as for its powerful subject. And Russell felt compelled from his very early beginnings as an artist to tell the whole story in a way that sort of complements what Caspar Whitney had said, tell the whole story of the West. So while Waiting for a Chinook was a masterpiece thematically and pictorially, it synthesizes in its time this scene in one little composite, 3 coyotes and a cow. It's a synthesis of what had become of the West, as opposed to the diversity of Breaking Camp. And it is, in that regard, quite an anomaly for young Charlie. But it was his most powerful and most important early work. More common were paintings like this one, which is oddly titled Last Painting. I think he meant latest painting, as it was produced in 1887, made into a lithograph. I don't know where the original is, probably Brian does. And it features 6 cowboy scenes or ranch life scenes gathered around a central rondel self-portrait. So the artist is an interpretive vortex for his world around him. So it sort of sums up the way he felt, where he was in the situation, and things, ideas of who cowboy and Western life was emanated from around that. Or scenes of 24 sketches that he sent to his friend Pony Bill Davis in 1889. Personal pictorial perspectives on frontier courtship, on Russell himself as an artist, on cowboys in their daily life, being sent out in the morning as line riders or getting bucked off a horse, or of his interpretation of native life. And very early on, it's kind of interesting, he recognized the difference between a real Indian of his day and an Indian that would make a good picture. This is a pretty early interpretation of that. We see the same kind of telling the whole story in the 12 paintings that he decided to put into his first published portfolio, Studies of Western Life, that was published in 1890. The whole story. See, for example, The Stand and Crossing the Missouri on the left, a double title for this painting. And you can see the endless herds of buffalo coming down to the Missouri to water and cross and go to new grazing grounds on the bottom. And on the top, you can see the hide hunters of the 1870s that decimated those same herds and made, essentially, the American bison nearly extinct. And then add to that the paradoxical association, of the painting to the right, which is called The Bronco Buster Driving In and The Cow Puncher. It's the same exact scene, except where the buffalo once were, now the cow is, the cattle are. And so it's a complex and tragic relationship between cattle grazing and bison extinction, and that wasn't lost on Charlie Russell. He obviously wanted to escape that. He wanted to celebrate the bison, and that's why he took the bison skull as his logo. But it became a perplexing thing for him, and I think later on, and Joan in her paper mentions this, that he reconciles this later by focusing on periods before his own time as opposed to during his life. In early works, we also see that sense of empathy that I mentioned earlier. His painting of Caught in the Act of 1888 shows a clear regard for the Indian's plight. This was in striking contrast to a similar scene painted exactly the same time by Frederick Remington called Arrest of a Blackfeet Murderer. In one scene, the cowboys are accommodating and being compassionate and have charity toward Indians who have been pushed toward starvation by circumstances of the white incursion. And on the right-hand side, we see no excuse, Indian, you're going to jail, kind of an interpretation. So there's a sense of accommodation in Russell's work and a sense of charity. Indian life as a self-sustaining mode was also something that Charlie Russell promoted, as had his predecessor, George Catlin. Views of daily life like the silk robe show a veneration for the everyday elements of Indian life. Now, about 20 years later, Joseph Henry Sharp, whose painting you see on the right, was given credit for being the first artist of his generation to reveal artists as real human beings in his paintings of home life among the Crow Indians. And yet it really wasn't Sharp. It was really Russell, who was singular and first amongst his generation of painters to portray Indians with a truthfulness that offered them cultural parity with Anglos. Of course, we can't forget John McStanley, who was a generation earlier, who roamed the same territory in 1853 as Russell did across Montana, and painted pictures like this with the same kind of sympathetic rendition of everyday Indian life in his works. And by 21st century standards, Russell is also remarkable for his gender inclusiveness. We look at these as two separate pictures, but if you put them together, they're sort of pendants. In many paintings that might be regarded as sequential, men and women played significant, equal kind of roles. The man doing the hunting of the buffalo, the woman finding a place where they could camp and resource that buffalo. And so neither one, the man doing the hunting or the woman finding a new home, was more important than the other. And in another realm, Russell, quite early on in his career, was acclaimed for his prowess as, quote, one of the best animal painters in the world. That was a quote from a magazine in 1891. And oils like the Buffalo Herd of 1890, in that painting he's praised for a truthfulness of character and detail. So we think of him by those comments as a naturalist artist, or part of a naturalist artist tradition, sort of like you would expect from Audubon or somebody. But it also is not all about detail. These are powerful metaphors at play in this painting. The flowing water in the background and the multi-generational context in which this herd is placed are promises of new life in 19th century, early 20th century painting. It may have been wishful thinking when he painted this in 1890 because there were less than 200 buffalo left in the United States. So the setting sun gives us this sort of dynamic of the other side of the equation, that this may be a species that is in fact potentially doomed in America. And that's a complex and interesting dichotomy that is presented in this painting. So it's not so much about natural history. It's not about painting buffalo. It's about painting a mythic figuration of buffalo, a mythic configuration or figuration of the history of nature, not natural history. That makes sense. When Russell left the range as a wrangler in 1894 to become a painter full-time, he had a host of challenges ahead of him. He had to make a living, of course, and to do that, he had to please his clientele. And he said about his clientele, well, they're pretty good critics as to detail, but they don't say much about my paintings. So he provided them with detail. He was also faced with eulogizing the now bygone era of the open-range cowboy. The Herd Quitter of 1897 not only recounts the thrill of the chase, but also glorifies the concept of teamwork. We don't think about that, but it's really teamwork, and it celebrates an exhilaration of physical labor by common man. So these are themes that are basic to his paintings. And when cowboys get in trouble, the painting to the right of 1899, that presents one of what Charles Russell called his moments of peril. But it's also about dedication and about sacrifice, and certainly about uncanny physical dexterity. In recording the close of the frontier, Russell tended not to evince any bitterness. His was not a querulous kind of temperament. He did, however, share with Frederick Remington a sense of understandable fatalism, and that's manifested in this work, The Trapper's Last Stand of 1899, which was his largest oil to that date, so far as we know. Russell shared not only the notion of fatalism with Remington, but also the composition as well. It was derived from Remington's an episode in the opening of A Cattle Country, which had appeared in 1887 in Roosevelt's book Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail. And this, in turn, had been inspired by a previous generation of French painters, military and history painters, who Remington had become familiar with when he was an art student at Yale in the 1870s. So Russell says he's an untrained painter and uninfluenced, but in fact he's influenced by Remington, who was influenced by the French. So there's this international thread that moves through his work. And Brian has told us in many of his writings how important German influences were in Russell's work, and how he relied on the works of Karl Weimar. We heard that in a Kirby/Joan lecture a few minutes ago. Planning the Attack is a Weimar painting, and it gave Russell a sort of a compositional model to work from. Also, very important for Russell, a vantage point. And whose vantage point is it when we're looking at the West? The vantage point comes from the Indian rather than the white person. So then that provides not only a viewpoint, but it also provides for a dramatic tension in the composition that makes it more exciting. So that's chapter 1. Do we have time for chapter 2? Okay. The opening of the new century coincides fundamentally with changes in Russell's creative output. Themes are altered very little, but techniques and style begin to get a fresh kind of look. Note the comparison between Indian Beauty Parlor of 1899 with a painting, The Indian Parlor of 1907. In the latter work, the carelessness of articulation seems to have vanished. The composition is tighter. Even the paper that he works on tightens that composition in and makes it more focused on the figures. Increasing the focus on the figures accentuates the narrative, makes the narrative more compelling, and the backlighting of figures creates a depth of atmosphere. Russell had also told Catherine Wilson when he was interviewing her that he had come to New York to learn to lay on color. And he may have learned that from John Marchand when Marchand wasn't roping fake cows in his studio. So the colors that you see here are richer and brighter and more saturated than they had been even as far early back as 1899. Similar differences can be seen in Russell's oils, The Death of a Gambler of 1903, and The Smoke of a 45 of 1908. Especially significant are Russell's centralizing of the figures, which heightens the drama and freezes the moment of action that is so compelling in presenting a dramatic narrative, freezes that moment in time. It's the same message of peril and desperation and desperate contest that's in the previous painting, but it's substantially enhanced. By the teens, Russell had converted sources of everyday Montana history, and you saw that in that pair of paintings of the Indian buffalo hunter and the women looking for a new camp of the 1890s. He took that women looking for camp and turned it into an image of an epic kind of scale and universal humanity. This is not just a narrative. This is not just an accounting of what Indians did. This is a celebration of Indian womanhood. His painterly devices, a new heightened palette, a sophisticated treatment of atmospheric perspective, effective focusing on the composition. And you'll notice that even though the foreground is still kind of blank, the composition of the grasses reflects the composition of the figures. So he's thinking about what foregrounds should do and how they should enhance and how they should work together with a painted narrative of figures. And there's a wonderful, in this painting, a wonderful nuanced sense of gesture. Every little idea that could be articulated in selecting where they're going to set up their camp, from the grandmother to the child, are there, but they're so subtle that they're only suggested, and it's a wonderful, masterful treatment that make this painting quite a masterwork. In historical episodes, Charlie Russell strove even higher places. Captain Lewis meeting the Indians of 1897 on the left, it can be compared to Lewis and Clark expedition of 1918. The first one is kind of congested and confusing as a composition, and that congestion and confusion subverts the narrative. We don't know what the narrative is until he's able to separate them and make them independent of one another in the later painting in this complex array of characters. And then he takes that to another level in 1912 in the Lewis and Clark meeting the Flatheads, an epic historical masterpiece. Combines a crescendo of galloping action with two very sedate kind of tableaus. On the one side, we see an Indian teepee camp, and on the other side, we see a negotiation, a diplomatic engagement underway. For Russell, history at this time of his life had to be living, it had to be potent, it had to be strong. And so the historical episode that is taking place on the right-hand side of the composition is heightened by the excitement of the Indians galloping up into the foreground and making their presence so strong. In 1914, Charlie produced his most accomplished pictorial treatise on natural history. It was called When the Land Belonged to God. You guys are pretty familiar with this picture. It's a sophisticated orchestration of light, of dust, of sky, punctuated by a monarchical display of male ego and arrogance, and the full pulse of animated life. Like the Animalier sculptor Alexander Phimister Proctor, who had just the year before produced a 13-foot bronzes for the Q Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., the largest animal bronzes in American history. 1 year before, Russell reveals the same kind of profound empathy with American wildlife. And yet it's kind of sad that Russell had to go to Yellowstone Park to find a buffalo to paint. And Proctor had to go to Edmonton to a wildlife preserve to find buffaloes to sculpt. There were literally none left in America. So it sort of gives us a wistful belief that America is a place of pristine beauty that will continue, but maybe very much it wouldn't. Its animals are emblems of a halcyon moment in time before Russell, in fact, before mankind, in both of these images. Now, with this, Russell gives us a sense of his sort of hierarchical value system in which the past is privileged over the present and over the future. Whatever was worthwhile, he told somebody, a friend of his, whatever was worthwhile, it happened a long time ago. Nothing that we do today is worth a damn. To better achieve that nostalgic vision, that mythic presence that Remington was trying to achieve in his later work, his paintings become increasingly idealized and contemplative. The painting in the Fireboat of 1918, in that painting, the immediate presence of the painting, the immediacy is the past. The future that we see on the side with the steamboat, the Missouri River steamboat coming up the river, that was a historical moment in the past, is totally marginalized. It's there, it's kind of a curiosity. The presence is